Okay, so well, look, good morning, Garret. It's lovely to have a chance to talk to you this morning. Could I just start off by asking you to say a little bit about who you are and where you work?
Yeah, so my name is Garret Barnwell. I'm a clinical psychologist actually by training, but work predominantly from a community psychology perspective. And I am now actually of very recent based at the University of Johannesburg as a postdoctoral research fellow. And then I've also got a community psychology practice and I also do therapy. Yeah, so that's just a bit of my background. And I'm based in Johannesburg in South Africa.
Okay, so you're based at the university, but you also have a community psychology practice, did you say?
Yeah, correct.
No.
Yeah. And yeah, a lot of my kind of work over the years has revolved around community psychology and stuff, but always with the edge of research as well. So I'm not quite sure where I fall on the spectrum, but mostly I would say applied research.
Applied research, you're right, absolutely. Okay, so and the practice, is that based in Johannesburg as well?
Yeah, the practice is based in Johannesburg, and then the kind of projects that I take on are around the country. So what I've been doing more recently, and maybe just to give a bit of a background and stuff like that. So I started actually first in the humanitarian sector. I didn't finish my psychology degree yet, and or I finished the undergrad and the honors, but hadn't done masters yet. And then did conflict studies and humanitarian assistance through Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine.
Okay.
And then started working for Doctors Without Borders on migration and advocacy. So it was actually an advocacy and media. And then, and that was in Johannesburg, looking at the reasons why people are forcefully displaced or leave their countries of origin, and bringing attention to xenophobia in South Africa. And through that, became more involved with the organization and ended up working in Somaliland during the Horn of Africa crisis, which was basically an extreme drought in 2011. It was hitting the area. And, sorry, you just broke up for a minute. And I was there working with Doctors Without Borders, rehabilitating a maternity hospital. And it also had a trauma unit and stuff like that. And the crisis hit in the middle, so I was part of the MOAC team, this where you do the mid-upper arm circumference, and we traveled around from different into different communities, basically measuring what the rate of malnutrition was, and thank goodness that it was relatively protected still at that time. But that was kind of the first very practical exposure to the impacts of climate change and changing world. And then after that, I went to work on Syria, the conflict there. So I was based in Lebanon and Turkey, and working with medical networks to get medication in and out of Syria.
Wow.
And so that was very transformative. And I returned in South Africa after that, did clinical psychology, and worked for the public system. And immediately after that, I went to Rustenburg, which is the center of platinum mining in the world. And it's based in South Africa. And also where just before I worked there, where the Marikana massacre was, where police basically shot down, I think it was 30, I'm going to get the figure wrong, but it was above 30 workers.
Wow.
And yeah, so that those were all kind of transformational moments. And in that work, basically what I was doing from then on was a lot of documentation practices in mine affected areas, but also in detention facilities and stuff like that. But I think those moments, looking at the Syria crisis, that it's been shown to be climate exacerbated, as well as Somalia, the Somali region, and also working in these mine affected regions, I couldn't switch off basically this ecological lens, and especially maybe even more so environmental justice lens. And yeah, that's so that's been the history.
So Garret, sorry, I may have broken up on your screen, and there were a couple of tiny moments on as I was listening to you where there was a slight breakdown in the noise, the sound, sorry, but actually it was I think it's all been good. So I think we've captured, I think we're capturing your account really well. And that's so interesting. So you described there, didn't you, some really important experiences and I guess learning, formal learning and informal learning experiences, didn't you? So like the conflict studies, for instance, was it with the Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine, was it?
Yeah, that was the humanitarian assistance, and then I did conflict studies actually in South Africa, Nelson Mandela University.
Okay, and then you got engaged with with crisis support systems, didn't you? And working internationally. I mean, these are I'm guessing that these are pretty significant, as you describe them, transformational experiences. And then you came back to South Africa with this, bringing this experience with you. But then you found yourself having further transformational experiences once you returned. So things like you described about, people being shot, in protests, in your own country. So these are significant issues. But you also kept this ecological perspective as well.
Yeah,
all that time.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So that, so I think that was really, if anything, I think what working in all of these kind of places really lifted the veil of modernity for me. And
can you say that again? Sorry.
So I'll just repeat it. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it really lifted the veil of modernity for me.
Okay.
And I think that, you had a question about concepts and what kind of informs my work and stuff like that. And I think for a while I've been looking around, really trying to see what theory helps describe the kind of work and stuff that I'm doing. And what's been really encouraging recently, I think, is some of the work by Garth Stevens and Christopher Song and them. All this work that's been coming out about epistemic justice, and then also ideas about modernity and coloniality, where you've got the school of thought that is, modernity is this rhetoric that there's one progressive pathway in history, and but the violence inherent in that is that it silences, excludes different ways of being in the world. And I definitely, from the work, seen that in conflict areas, seen it in working in mine-affected communities and stuff, where there is this imbalance of power and this rhetoric of development and it's bringing benefits to people, but actually, while some do see benefits in some of these processes and stuff, there are many people that are left unheard. And it also leaves, I think, an incredible trail of violence, structural violence.
Mm. Mm. And those are, I guess, those are things that often, when we're operating as psychologists, we're often unconscious of, you know, that positioning. You know, that we're operating often from within, you know, the modernist perspective, and we're often unwittingly uncritical of some of these things. We haven't lifted the veil of modernity. That's a phrase I haven't heard before, Garret, so thanks for that. And epistemic injustice, I guess, is a relatively new thing for me as well. Is it, so this is the idea that the way that, you know, the knowledge that we create and use often reflects power imbalances and doesn't do justice to the stories, people's own stories of their lives, and in many cases prevents them from even developing their own story of their own lives. Is that how you would describe it, or do you have
Definitely, yeah. I think it's a really good way to describe it and stuff, and I can give a few practical examples. I think, for instance, so the idea of modernity, coloniality, has really been articulated by this group of Latin American theorists, and more broadly around the world. But to refer particularly to Walter Mignolo and Anibal Quijano, all these theorists from the South. And what they recognize is that there's this inherent violence that underpins this logic of modernity. And the logic, this rhetoric of modernity, is based on what is essentially a European or American perspective of the world. And that is rooted in these long histories of expansion across the global South. So what they say is, you know, there's a collusion as well. These ideas, ways of being, and thoughts also are reflected in governance structures, in institutions, and I think what you see in economics is that there's the belief that this extractive pathway that's based on fossil fuels and all of that is essentially should be the dominant kind of way of development. And in that logic, there's then really all this violence of exclusion and stuff. So we know that much of the extractive industry, their processes, how they accumulate wealth, is through dispossessions of different sort, whether it being concerns that are silenced, knowledge that has been made destitute, and land disposition. And so it's a really, I think, a very useful kind of concept. And then the idea of epistemic justice is how do we de-link from these logics of modernity, or reclaim certain processes with the aims of bringing in different voices, unsettling what is essentially, like what Mignolo says, what is essentially quite a, I don't think he uses the word bloated, but quite a disproportionately a disproportionate ideology that's really tried to expand its epistemic territory across the world. And so that's where it's rooted. Some practical examples would be, for instance, during public participation processes. So it's one area that I'm starting to look at more recently, which is what happens in discourses with communities when these projects are proposed. there's really what's been enunciated in these spaces, or what I'm thinking about more recently, is that, you know, it is all of this is for jobs, is for progress, development, but certain ways of being in the world, like, for instance, in Limpopo, in the northern part of South Africa, traditional knowledge being discounted, whether it be about water, spirituality, the ecology, these ways of being discounted and even seen as a threat to this rhetoric. So there's these tensions and clashes that take place. The other one as well, and this, for me personally, you know, I was trained as a clinical psychologist, working in Rustenburg, you know, very ready to kind of put a diagnosis on everything, and and also unlearning my own clinical training in some way, still keeping an eye, but being aware of also damage sense narratives, and yeah, and so maybe a third example, for instance, I wrote a paper some while back, about two years ago, or a year ago, on climate anxiety, and how there's this universalization of the term. And I was a bit critical on that. He's saying, you know, I'm a bit worried about that, because it actually individualizes the issue and really discounts the politicization and contextualization of what's taking place in some of these issues in the global south. I can only speak from my position.
Yeah. But those are three great examples, Garret, and they really bring, I think they really bring the concept to life, you know, the idea of, you know, looking at how, say, a narrative is imposed, and the kind of the struggle for meaning, I guess, between two different perspectives. And then, you know, so like the first example you described, and then the one, again, as you say, like, you know, as a psychologist, you know, we kind of find ourselves sometimes uneasy, don't we, with the kind of tasks that we're expected to perform within that role. Do you know, like the way that we do, you know, clinical psychologizing of the people that we work with. And that last one is, I guess, so pertinent, isn't it? The one about climate anxiety, and as you say, the way it individualizes and decontextualizes something and turns it into an emotion, you know, which in itself is the product of a whole set of social and political and economic processes. And I guess, as you say, it's only one way of reflecting on the emotion that comes through. Because I think I read in some of your work a kind of a range of possible emotions that could be associated, you know, so it doesn't have to be anxiety, does it? You know, what about, I think, anger, you know, for instance, you know, that those elements as well that could come with it. But yeah,
definitely.
Wow.
And yeah, so it's also interesting, this kind of clinic position with what do you you know, in the decolonial literature, anger plays a really important role, because it points to some form of injustice. So while we may say, okay, we need to, you know, do we treat the anger or do we promote it? And and yeah, so it's quite interesting as well where we place these kind of emotions. And then what I always say as well is that something like climate anxiety as well, it serves a purpose. It's played a really important role in the politics of recognition, especially in the North, bringing a focus on specific issues, and youth climate activists have used it very well. And definitely the you know, these feelings that people are experiencing about the world changing are there. So yeah, I try to strike a nuance between the two.
Yeah. What, so you've noticed like some people using climate anxiety in a helpful way, using the term in a helpful way. Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's it originates from the public. It's not a psychology term. It first came from, I think, the public trying to explain these kind of feelings that we all experience. And so in that sense, I think it's been pretty useful in just drawing attention to this view of the world changing. And stuff. And yeah, my kind of question is, is it always contextually, so in my work with mine affected communities, for instance, what's front and center is there may be distress related to one's environment, but the point of change that needs to take place is access to better resources, and service delivery and stuff like that are rooted in these histories of apartheid. So it becomes a environmental justice issue through also this lens of South Africa's racist history.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really helpful point, isn't it? Because we're all operating in different social contexts, aren't we, with different histories and different relationships between different groups in our societies. So I guess what I just wanted to ask you about, Garret, before we finish up for this conversation, was about some of your recent work, because psychologists produce expert reports at times, don't they? But they're usually around, like an individual or a family maybe. But you've just produced an expert report around, a piece of activism in South Africa. Is it okay just to say a little bit about that and how that?
Yeah, definitely. So the expert report was launched a short while ago, and basically it's on the psychological impacts of climate change in South Africa. And and then this week, which is very exciting, it was submitted along with a whole bunch of other expert reports in one of the first youth-led climate cases, where the 3 civil society organizations are basically making a constitutional case, saying that procuring more coal-fired. Are you still there? Oh, sorry. Okay. So what these organizations, the case that they launched is a constitutional case saying that the procurement of further coal power is a human rights issue and a constitutional injustice. So all their expert reports have been filed as part of that. And basically what it's trying to do is, in the courts, the environmental justice organizations have been addressing each case one by one, and they've been really successfully winning them, which is great. And this one's directed at policy and the legislative framework, and the idea would be that it closes the valve on any new coal power. So yeah, it's very encouraging, and it's awesome to be part of. And and then some of the other works also similar to this. So the research that I'm doing on epistemic violence, I've also been on the side of submitting applications or submissions for different processes and stuff, bringing these issues to light. So both working at a very practical level, submitting to these public participatory processes, and then writing it up on the side.
Wow. So do you do this as part of your community psychology practice or part of a university role, or how do you do all this work, Garret? How does it work for you?
So I do it as the community psychology practice. Both those reports mentioned pro bono. So the clinical practice and the research subsidizes
Yeah,
the
yeah,
community psychology practice.
yeah, yeah. It's kind of an ongoing challenge, isn't it, about how you materially survive as a community psychologist, you know, and do work that feels and is significant.
Yeah,
You know, an important piece of advocacy that you're describing there, and you know, support using your kind of your expertise, you know, to help people make their case.
yeah,
It's enormously valuable. It's
yeah,
enormously valuable, but what the social value that's placed on it, you know, uh, it's kind of, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? You know, where we feel we do a lot of our most important work and how it happens. But yeah.
yeah.
Mm.
And Prof. Brendan Barnes has been very supportive actually from the University of Johannesburg. So we're working now on a bunch of projects looking at threats to environmental defenders.
Mm.
So being able to draw a couple of links between different things, research projects, practical
Mm.
application of community psychology and stuff.
Mm.
So it's,
Mm.
I think it's nice to meet everyone because it's forming this little network
Mm.
of people that's very, yeah, very brings a lot of hope. It's encouraging.
Well, and really nice, Garret. I know we're going to have to end in a moment, but that's such a great point, isn't it, about collectivizing the network? You know, like networking, speaking to other people, offering each other mutual support in practical and social ways. You know, so that's a great observation to kind of bring things to an end on. So look, I just want to say thank you very much for your time this morning. That's been so interesting. And I think a lot of people are going to find this a really, really interesting interview, Garret. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Carl. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Okay.
I hope
Cheers.
so. Thank you.